With more and more vehicles finally gaining access to the Tesla Supercharger network, the interesting question comes down to, when is this going to become simplified? Because while it's definitely much better than no access at all to be able to use an adapter, and at least with Ford and Rivian's vehicles, you have plug-and-charge functionality. For whatever reason, Chevy wasn't able to do that, so you have to activate the charging session from the Chevy app. Way too many steps, in my opinion, especially if we want EVs to go mainstream. So a lot of these automakers have committed to adopting the NACS port itself on their vehicles so that in 2025 and for some later, you'll just be able to drive anywhere and plug in anywhere, not have to worry if you have the right adapter or how do I activate the magic dock. Instead, you could hopefully, similar to a gas station, only have to worry about the payment method. That could be done through the app, but the plugging in of the vehicle should just be, park, grab cable, plug in. But ironically, there's actually some compatibility issues when it comes to the vehicles that have actually unveiled 2025 model years that have the NACS port on the vehicle itself. The first one that was unveiled was the Hyundai Ioniq 5. They're saying for the 2025 model year, which is now being assembled in America, which is pretty cool, they're actually building the NACS port on the vehicle itself. The ironic part of the Ioniq 5, though, is that it is still located, at least in the media images, on the passenger side rear, which means it'll be occupying 2 spaces at most of the 15,000 V3 superchargers out on the roads. That's not going to be ideal. It means you're going to be occupying spaces and have to worry about the cables reaching. Because as I try to remind people, not all superchargers have the exact same layout. Some of them have it between the stalls, some of them have it behind the stalls, and all kinds of different configurations in between. And if that wasn't enough, the other confusing part about the Ioniq 5 switching over to NACS is it's based on an 800 volt architecture, the eGMP platform they call it, that the EV9, the Ioniq 6, the Ioniq 5, the EV6 is all based on. That's a higher voltage architecture, and right now, if you take a Hyundai or Kia EV to a Tesla supercharger that has the magic dock and is ready to charge non-Teslas already, you'll notice that it doesn't get very great speeds. It maxes out at about 100 kilowatts using the motor's inverter in order to drop the voltage lower as much as possible, but I'm really hoping, and they haven't really detailed this in their announcements, that the Ioniq 5, at least the one with NACS, builds in a way for you to split the pack voltage so it can actually achieve north of 200 kilowatts, because we know the Hyundai Ioniq vehicles are capable of charging well over 200 kilowatts when they have a working and reliable Electrify America station that charges at 800 volts, but obviously none of the superchargers in the ground currently have that, and it's gonna feel weird if you start shipping NACS on the vehicle itself, and yet in order to achieve more than 100 kilowatts, you have to use an adapter. Now they would have to go to an EA station, put an adapter on the end of an 800 volt vehicle in order to actually achieve their peak speeds. I doubt the adapter would be included, but what do you guys think? Is it better for future proofing to just say, yeah, we know at superchargers it only gets 100 kilowatts, but the adapter is just a short-term thing, and long-term, we know that ChargePoint in EA is going to be switching over to NACS, so that's okay if it's a little bit awkward and clunky in the meantime. We know that long-term there will be 800 volt NACS ports, but there's just not a lot right now. I don't know. Where do you guys fall on that subject? Please let me know in the comments below. But similar story, the only other company that has shown a vehicle that's intending to launch in 2025, I'm not counting the Rivian R2 or R3 because they're not shipping until 2026 and later, but the Lucid Gravity has actually showcased where their NACS port is, and unlike the Ioniq 5, thankfully they do actually show it positioned on the driver's side rear. Same as Tesla, means the Lucid Gravity should easily be able to occupy only 1 space at superchargers, and because it's in the exact same position as Tesla, you don't have to worry about the layout of the supercharger network. The cable should reach no problem at all 17,000 plus stalls, which is fantastic because, in my opinion, Lucid makes some incredible vehicles with some great engineering, but the biggest Achilles heel of that brand and their products was always the charging infrastructure. That was a deal breaker for a ton of people out there. You don't want to spend $150,000 on your luxury sedan and be stuck in Walmart parking lots waiting behind Chevy Bolts to finish charging to 100%. That's a problem, and Lucid, in my opinion, wasn't spending enough time on charging infrastructure for their vehicles, and that's why, thankfully, supercharger access and positioning the charge port in the optimum location benefits their vehicles a whole lot. But similar to what I said with the Ioniq 5, the Lucid is also based on a much higher voltage architecture. In fact, the Lucid is actually closer to like 900 volts than 800, which is why, as I said before, you could take a Lucid Air to a supercharger with a magic dock now, and the peak speed is less than 50 kilowatts, which for a road trip machine like a Lucid is just unacceptable and very much put to shame, considering it's a vehicle that can charge at well over 300 kilowatts. So that's why I'm very curious what Lucid's plans are for the Gravity, which they said in early 2025 they will make the switch to the NACS port on the Gravity vehicles. I'm hoping they do it for the Lucid Air as well, but I'm really hoping they build in a way for that battery pack to split the voltage, charge at much higher speeds at superchargers, which we know are capable of doing well over 200 kilowatts. In fact, some of the V3 Plus stations have proven they can go over 300 kilowatts, which Lucid could really benefit from if these stations were actually 800 volts, but they're not. So charge port is better, but the voltage problem still exists, and Lucid has not clarified whether or not they are building in a way for the battery pack to split the voltage, similar to what you see the Cybertruck do, which is also on a higher voltage architecture, but obviously can achieve peak speeds with all of the existing charging infrastructure. So that's the way to do it. Hopefully Hyundai and Lucid are listening. But again, both of these companies aren't giving a firm date. They're just saying the 2025 model year. So at this point, knowing how legacy automakers work, I wouldn't be surprised if Hyundai with the Ioniq 5 might beat out Lucid, because we know that Gravity deliveries are starting at the end of this year. They already have pre-production builds coming off the assembly line, but they're still claiming that they're gonna make the switch to NACS in early 2025, which is weird. That means building a few Lucid Gravities with CCS for just a couple of months or 1 or 2 quarters. So if I were to guess, maybe the Ioniq 5 will come out a little bit ahead, but perhaps if I am wrong and Hyundai decides to delay the switch to NACS until they figure out how to split the voltage of the pack, or Tesla starts deploying at least some 800 volt stations, which company is planning to launch in 2025, like earlier within the year, that is based on the 400 volt architecture like most Teslas are, and has unveiled a vehicle with a NACS inlet instead of just saying like, oh yeah, eventually we'll support NACS. I've heard from a few different sources that GM actually doesn't plan on adopting the NACS port on their vehicles until the 2026 model year, so those aren't going to be ready. Things like the Equinox or the Blazer or the Silverado, those are still going to require an adapter for most of 2025. Well, there is actually one vehicle that's based on the lower voltage architecture that has been unveiled from day one with the NACS inlet, and that's Aptera. So they're not exactly on the driver's side rear, but there is a charge port behind the little license plate on the back, and it is slightly pivoted towards the left side, which means even though it's a bit more centered than other EVs out there, the Aptera should be able to reach most supercharger locations no problem. There might be a small handful where, you know, the charging stalls are mounted in between the cars. There I could see a situation where maybe it's difficult to get that cable to reach to the back of the Aptera. We'll see, but the good news is the wheel pants are mounted a little bit further behind, so you should be able to pull up pretty deep into a supercharger stall to try to get that cable to reach to the back of the Aptera. But funny enough, even though they're a startup and yes, this is their first vehicle and first product and everything, they're the company that in my opinion feels like the most prepared to gain supercharger access. For one, they have much lower peak speeds than Ioniq or the Lucid does, because they're just targeting to hit around 50 to 60 kilowatts, which we know Tesla is comfortable supporting on the supercharger network, because you can now charge Chevy Bolts at open superchargers even if they don't have magic docks. As long as you have an adapter, you can plug in a Chevy Bolt, even though it maxes out at 50 kilowatts. The Aptera is so insanely efficient, it can achieve 500, 600 miles an hour just by achieving around 50 to 60 kilowatts at superchargers, and it's not based on an 800 volt architecture, so you don't have to worry about splitting the battery pack in order to achieve those peak speeds. And the charge port is on the rear, a little bit biased to the driver, not as much as the Lucid Gravity, which I think will fit at any supercharger stall no problem. The Aptera should be mostly fine at the majority of them. Maybe just the width and the fact that it's more centrally located could cause a handful of problems, but they've taken the Aptera Gamma prototype to the superchargers in San Diego and of course got the cables to reach no problem. Hopefully long term Tesla is able to roll out more of these V3 Plus sites, because they have longer cables and it should reach either side of the vehicle no matter which EV you have. So that's obviously ideal. But of course Tello Trucks is also intending to have NACS on day one, and if things go according to plan, first delivery should be the end of 2025. So I have some insight at least to that timeline. But what other vehicles that are supposed to be around in 2025 do you guys know about that are going to be switching to NACS? Rivian said they're gonna do it but haven't unveiled it on any R1 product, and I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pushed back later into 2025, because they've got the Adventure Network chargers with CCS and their cables are all laid out for driver side front. So switching the NACS port on the Rivian vehicles is going to be a little tricky. Hopefully Ford is able to adopt NACS as well. They've said they plan on building it into the vehicles in 2025. They were the first major company to announce NACS support and gain Supercharger access. So let me know your guesses for who will be first to NACS down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.